Welcome everyone to our first Lunch and Learn of the new year. A tale of two rivers, dam removal and fish restoration on the Kennebec. The Kennebec was once the most productive river in Maine, but today the future of the Kennebec River is at a critical point. Atlantic salmon are on the brink of extinction, and their recovery depends on further restoration and potentially on the removal of several dams. This year, the Maine Legislature will consider a bill intended to prevent removal of these dams. Restoration in this region is critical to meeting the recovery goals for endangered salmon, so it's complicated. We are delighted to have some experts with us today to break down the biology and the politics of river restoration and dam removal. Jeff Reardon is Maine Brook Trout Project Director at Trout Unlimited, and Sean Mahoney is Executive Vice President and Director of the Conservation Law Foundation in Maine. Thank you so much for joining us, gentlemen. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 10,000 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. A few technical notes for today. We will hear from our speakers and then tackle questions in the Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait though. You can send your questions to me through the chat whenever they occur to you, and I'll keep track of them and ask them during the Q&A at the end. If you have any technical difficulties today, you can message Will Sedlak through the chat and he will help you out. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, where you can also find recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns. Thank you again for joining us. And Jeff, I will turn it over to you to kick things off.
Great. Kathleen, can you all see my screen now?
We are good to go.
You're good to go. Excellent. So first of all, thank you to Maine Conservation Voters for inviting Sean and I. And thank you to all of you for joining us on a snow day when you could probably be out skiing or sledding or dealing with your kids who were variously excited or disappointed about having or not having school. Just by way of quick introduction, I grew up here in Maine. I was a military brat, moved here when I was about 10. Went through high school here in Maine, went away and came back about 10 years later. And have been working in mostly environmental jobs ever since 1994. My actual first day as an employee for Trout Unlimited came about 2 weeks after the Edwards Dam was breached. So I was not involved in the work on the Edwards Dam, which was breached in 1999, but started working for TU soon thereafter and have been working on the Kennebec, the Penobscot, and all over Maine since then. My first photo here is actually the day, I think it was July 3rd, 1999, when Edwards Dam was breached. I'm willing to bet a fair number of you were standing there watching along with me. And really what we want to talk about is the idea that we've come a long way on restoring rivers in Maine. And I think the take home point is where we have done that by removing dams, we have been wildly successful. Where we have attempted to do it by building fishways, we have been wildly unsuccessful. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those issues on the Kennebec, and then Sean's going to talk about a very complex regulatory process that gives us an opportunity to maybe address that in the relatively near future. So let's, okay, excuse me for a second. I am not having my slides advance from my screen. So I'm going to stop sharing. I've got to minimize this. I apologize, folks. Let's do that again. There we go. Not sure why that wasn't working, but now it is. So Sean and I are here representing a group called the Kennebec Coalition, which I think would be best characterized as a loose affiliation of like-minded organizations. There is no formal structure, but we've all been working together with other partners along the way for 20 plus years on restoration of the Kennebec and many other places. But formally in some current regulatory affairs at FERC and the Maine DEP, NRCM, Trout Unlimited, the Atlantic Salmon Federation, CLF, and Maine Rivers are generally filing joint comments, participating jointly. And our goal is to get what you see on the left. That's one of ASF's employees, Miranda Namath. She is releasing a salmon that I believe has just been trapped and trucked from Waterville to be released in the Sandy River, which is where the mother lode of salmon habitat in the Kennebec River is. I want to start just to give you the evidentiary support for my assertion at the beginning that where we have removed dams, we've been wildly successful restoring sea-run fish, and where we haven't, we've been wildly unsuccessful. If you look at the river below Waterville, where the Edwards Dam was removed and the Fort Halifax Dam was removed, and this is including the Sebasticook, which is the only major tributary that comes into that reach. The river is entirely free-flowing. It used to be 17 miles of it used to be impounded. Over the last 5 years, we've averaged 3.8 million river herring that went up the Sebasticook, plus probably at least 1 million more, and maybe more than that, going up 7 Mile Stream and Cobbossee Stream and other tributaries. We've restored a thriving American shad run. I would put the lower Kennebec River as probably the best shad fishery on the East Coast. My friends who fish it regularly can routinely catch 10 to 20 shad per hour with beginning fishermen. I mean, it is just a phenomenally productive fishery. There are no salmon returns to that portion of the river, largely because there's no salmon habitat there. Pretty much everything below Lockwood is either tidal or it is so warm, so large, and not of suitable substrate to provide habitat for salmon. And the few tributaries that come into it are exceedingly small and really don't have much capacity. By contrast, at Waterville, you hit the first dam, the Lockwood Dam, and then 3 more dams in the next, I believe it's 4 dams in 19 miles of river. 84% of the river from Waterville, Lockwood Dam, up to the mouth of the Sandy River is impounded, meaning it's flat and still behind dams, not free flowing. The 5-year river average river herring count is only 200,000 captured at the fish lift at the Lockwood Dam. Annual shad capture is 44 to 400, depending on the year. The 5-year average is a little over 100. And just by way of contrast, I know multiple individual anglers who catch more shad than that, certainly in a season, and sometimes they catch more than the fish lift captures all year in one day. And there are some annual salmon returns. Those are fish that are going to the Sandy River. They've ranged between a low of 11 and a high of 56 with a 5-year average of 35. So we have salmon, they're getting to the river, but it's pretty difficult for them to do so. We'll talk about that in a minute. Why are we focused on the Kennebec? It's the 2nd largest river in Maine. It's got existing populations of all native fish. Historically, it probably had the state's largest salmon run. It's a little hard because things change so early in history to know whether the Kennebec or the Penobscot had more fish, but between them, they were huge compared to the other rivers in the state. It's the only US opportunity we have to restore completely unobstructed access to a large amount of highly suitable habitat for salmon. It's designated as critical habitat under the Endangered Species Act for salmon. We've got the capacity that we know fish populations in it recover when we remove dams. And we've got a current regulatory process that Sean's going to talk about that provides us with an opportunity to address some of the existing problems. And I just want to talk about what sea-run fish we're talking about. I am mostly going to talk about Atlantic salmon because that's largely what's going to drive the regulatory process we're in the middle of. But our goals are to restore all the native fish above Waterville, and those include 2 species of river herring, alewife and blueback herring. Probably ecologically, those are the most important. American shad, probably the most important fishery we're proposing to restore here. Endangered Atlantic salmon, of course, and also sea lamprey and American eel. American eel might give the river herring a good run for their money in terms of ecological importance. We are not talking about the 2 species of sturgeon or striped bass because historically they did not ascend the river above Waterville, except maybe in very extraordinary water conditions. So now focusing on salmon, as I said, that's where we're going to spend most of our time because that's going to drive a lot of what happens over the next several years. There is a recovery plan under the Endangered Species Act for Atlantic salmon. It divides the state up into 3 shrews. I apologize for that acronym. Doesn't exactly trip off the tongue, but there's significant habitat recovery units. And the recovery plan is structured such that we have to see significant progress in increasing salmon numbers in 2 of the 3 shrews and overall in the state of Maine to either downlist salmon from endangered to threatened or to take them off the endangered species list altogether. So we got to make 2 of these 3 work. Realistically, the places we have the best opportunity to make change are in the Penobscot and the Merry Meeting Bay shrews, because those are the places where we know very clearly that what some of the obstacles to recovery are. We'll talk about that a little bit. So now I'm focused in on what's the Merry Meeting Bay shrew. It is largely the Kennebec River, but it also includes the Sheepscot, the Androscoggin as far upstream, but not above Lewiston, and then several rivers in the mid-coast, the Madomic and the St. George, not the Damariscotta, which historically probably didn't support Atlantic salmon. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the Sandy River that we're going to focus on a lot is this mother lode of habitat on the to the left side of my slide. What's yellow and red here, yellow is high value rearing habitat for salmon, so where juvenile salmon would live in the river. Red is spawning habitat. And you can see how dense that concentration of high value habitat is in the Sandy compared even to the Sheepscot, which also has very large capacity. Those are really the 2 places in the Merry Meeting Bay shrew that there's any focus on salmon recovery. There's not much going on in the Kennebec main stem because it doesn't have the habitat. Not much going on in the lower Androscoggin for similar reasons, and not much going on in the Madomic and the St. George. We're really putting all of our eggs into the Sandy and the Sheepscot. And just thinking about a comparison between the 2, if you want to make the Kennebec shrew work for salmon, why are we so focused on the Sandy and not the Sheepscot? Well, again, one is because we know about these 4 dams on the Kennebec, and therefore getting them out of the way so fish can get to the Sandy needs to happen. The dam removals to let salmon get to where they need to be on the Sheepscot have already happened. That's a very significant difference, thanks to our friends at ASF. But it's also because of the amount and quality of habitat in the Sandy versus any place else, not just in the Kennebec shrew, but any other river statewide, with the possible exception of the Piscataquis tributary of the Penobscot. And just the comparison here, I'm not going to run through these numbers, but roughly the Sandy River has 8 times as much habitat as the Sheepscot does. In a river, if you count up the river miles, it's actually shorter. There are fewer miles of habitat in the Sandy watershed than the Sheepscot, but there's 8 times as much habitat. And that speaks to its quality in that the Sandy, I mean, it's draining off mountains that are 3,500 feet high instead of off the coastal lowlands like the Sheepscot. So it's colder, it's higher gradient, it's surrounded by forest land. It's just really prime and productive habitat. If we can get eggs in the Sandy, they grow like crazy and produce smolts like crazy. The challenge is getting those smolts back to the ocean over 4 dams and then getting them from the ocean back to spawning habitat over 4 dams. And right now, this is the only significant chunk of habitat in the state that has an active salmon restoration program, but is ranked by the state and the federal agencies as not accessible to salmon. That map on the left shows areas within the Merry Meeting Bay shrew that are either accessible, partially accessible, or not accessible. And our biggest chunk of highest value habitat is all in the not accessible category. And the only way adult salmon can get there to spawn is by trap and truck. And What does trap and truck mean? Well, these are the 4 dams we're talking about from left to right. The Lockwood Dam in Waterville, Winslow, the Hydro Kennebec Dam, just a mile upstream, also in Waterville, Winslow. About 4 miles above that is the Shawmut Dam in Fairfield on one shore and Clinton on the other. And then farthest upstream is the Weston Dam, another 12 miles upstream, which is in Skowhegan. In order to get from Lockwood, where there's a fish lift that captures at least some salmon every year upstream, the fish have to take a ride in a truck around these 4 dams. That means they have to be netted, captured and moved, put into a tank in a truck, driven 45 miles, placed in the river, and then allowed to spawn sometime later in the season. This is that process. This is how they move. So in this case, this is actually a fish that was rescued, that got trapped below the Lockwood Dam, did not find the fishway, but had it found the fishway, the process would have been the same. It shows up wherever it's captured. It moves from there into the truck in this rubber sleeve full of water. This one actually was carried up about a, I don't know, 450-foot steep slope to get from the edge of the river into this truck, put it in the truck, along with whatever other fish show up that day, and drive it 45 miles to release it up near Strong on the Sandy River. Obviously, that's not an ideal situation. It sure doesn't meet recovery goals to have salmon restoration dependent on that. And now, so we've talked about the dams, we've talked about fish having to go around them. I also just want to talk a little bit about big picture habitat. So I'm not showing the dams here. We'll get to that in a second. This slide would be too busy if I showed it. But just to orient you, what you are seeing in pink, light blue, and green is the main stem Kennebec River. I'm not showing all of it. I'm cutting it off a little bit north of Skowhegan, just above the Weston Dam, but flowing from Skowhegan through Waterville, through Augusta, and then downstream to Popham Beach. What's in green is tidal river. What's in light blue is free flowing, and what's in pink is backed up behind impoundments. And if we focus on just the section of river between Waterville, which now has the first dam, and the mouth of the Sandy, which is in dark blue and is the mother lode of habitat in the watershed, of the 30 plus or minus miles of river between Waterville and the mouth of the Sandy, 27 of those miles are impoundments and about 5 are free flowing. Those numbers aren't exact, but that's about the ratio. It's 80% or more of the river is backed up behind dams. So even if there are fishways and the fish are swimming through that river, they're not swimming through the river they evolved to swim through. They're swimming through stagnant, warm, deeper impoundments than would be the case. That's true both going upstream and coming downstream, and there are differences that matter in both directions. So focusing now I'm in the middle part. We're just looking at the section from Augusta upstream to just above Skowhegan and the lower end of the Sandy. In red are the 4 dams in question, Lockwood, Hydro Kennebec, both in the Waterville area, Shawmut, just above them in Fairfield, and Weston up in Skowhegan with the same map. So what's pink is impounded behind the 4 dams, what's blue, free flowing. If we've been looking at this 24 years ago, what was from Edwards to Lockwood would also be in the pink color as impounded, but that section of the river was restored and is now riverine. And then I'll just note in yellow, there are 3 dams that have been removed in the anticipation of salmon recovery. Well, 2 of the 3 for salmon, the other for other species. The Edwards Dam came out in 1999. ASF and TU worked with the dam owner of the Madison Electric Dam to take that out in 2006, expecting that a few years later there would be fishways letting salmon swim there. That didn't exactly work out. And the Fort Halifax Dam came out on the Sebasticook, which is largely responsible for the river herring recovery in the lower Kennebec. So the problem, and we know this from multiple sources, I'm not going to cite all of them, but we know that the problem is too many dams. We've got 4 dams with upstream passage inefficiencies. We've got 4 dams with downstream passage inefficiencies. And we've got 84% of the river from Waterville to the mouth of the Sandy impounded. So it's kind of a death of 10,000 cuts is an overused analogy, but I actually think it's fairly fair here. If you've got 4 dams in a short section of river, we know from multiple studies, significant impacts on both upstream migrating and downstream migrating salmon. We also know from just about everybody who's taken a look at salmon recovery, whether specifically in the Kennebec or in Maine, just about every agency or expert that's looked at that has said, you got a bunch of problems, but first and foremost, you've got to deal with your dams. We had the National Academy of Sciences say that to us in a 2004 report that Governor King asked for, now Senator King. The recovery plan from the federal agencies says that. DMR's plan, both statewide and their specific plan for the Kennebec says that. Frankly, the FERC FEIS for the Edwards Dam removal back in 1997 said that. There really isn't any question that these dams are an impediment. The real question is whether you can resolve that impediment with fishways or it's going to require dam removals. And I just want to talk a little bit about some of the problems, even if we built state-of-the-art fishways at all 4 of these dams. I will say those of us who have watched the Lockwood fish lift fail since 2008 are somewhat skeptical about the idea that the dam owner is going to build 4 fishways and they're all going to work, given our experience with them having built one that has failed pretty abjectly. But let's assume the best case scenario, they build the best fishways money can buy, and all 4 of them work every year under various water conditions they may experience. You still have all of these problems. For upstream passage, can fish find the fishway? Do they get attracted falsely to someplace water is spilling that's not near the fishway? That's a very significant problem at Lockwood. Maybe as many as half the fish go to the other side of the river instead of the side that has the fishway on it. Delays, which have been very well documented by studies by the University of Maine, I'll talk about in a minute. Injuries, as you can see on this fish, this is one of the fish that was netted during the fish rescue event this June that TU and ASF volunteers helped with. This is DMR's photo out of their report of the incident, but that scar on its belly is from this fish being attracted to the wrong side of the river, beating itself up on the rocks, and then getting stuck there when the river flow dropped. And then cumulative impacts. So you get past one dam, it maybe takes you a couple extra weeks and you lose a few scales, but you've got to do that 4 times if you're a salmon and you want to get to the Sandy River. And similarly for downstream passage, this is a smolt captured during that same fish rescue event. The smolts are the salmon going to sea after they've spent a couple of years in fresh water. Route selection for them is a little bit different. Are they going to go through the turbines? That's not a good route. You become sushi if you're a fish and go through turbines, or at least some of them do, versus gates, versus spilling over the parts of the dam that spill. Do they get injured through those various routes of passage? And all 3 of them can have different kinds of injury problems. Do they get delayed? It's very different coming down a 12-mile long impoundment that is not flowing towards the ocean very fast than it would be coming down a natural river. And so they likely move much more slowly through it. And increased predation. And there's some growing research at UMaine that suggests that predation in impoundments, at least on the Penobscot, which is where they've studied it so far, is a huge issue. And I'll just a shout out to Joe Zidleski's lab at UMaine. He's had multiple graduate students over the last 10 plus years doing various tag studies on adult and juvenile salmon going upstream and downstream in both the Kennebec and the Penobscot. And they've done a really spectacular job of advancing the literature on what we know about passage inefficiencies, both upstream and downstream. I'm not going to read this whole slide because I don't want to steal Sean's time to talk about the regulatory and the situation and the opportunity in front of us. But suffice it to say, a graduate thesis comes out virtually every year with new information about the degree of impacts we see on fish for the dams. Most notably, the most 2 recent studies we've seen, one of which has been published, at least as a thesis, and is going to be coming out as a paper soon, the other of which is a thesis still in progress. But one says that 30% of the salmon smolts coming down the Penobscot get lost in the impoundments with based on the kinds of tags they're using. They can tell what's happened to those, and it's almost always predation. 30% of the fish coming down the river are being lost to predation in the impoundments. Some get lost in the free-flowing river segments, more get lost in the estuary, but the biggest source of mortality seems to be the impoundments behind the dams. And then for upstream salmon, Sarah Rubenstein's thesis just showed that just the delays at the 4 dams on the Kennebec are enough to significantly impact spawning success for fish once they get to spawning habitat, and probably enough to prevent us from having what are called repeat spawners, which are adult salmon that spawn once, go back to the ocean, and come back and spawn again. And that she's got a very complicated model looking at energy and temperature and delays at the dams, and it's a pretty damning story. Pardon the pun. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Sean, who I think is going to talk us through the opportunity that's in front of us over the next few years.
Great, thanks, Jeff. And there is a great opportunity in front of us. I think it's worthwhile to remind or to emphasize what Jeff said at the outset, which is Maine has been a leader nationally with respect to river restoration. So on the Kennebec, on the Penobscot, on the Presumpscot, and in doing that, it's taken many hands and many years. In addition to the 5 organizations that Jeff noted at the outset, there are many others, particularly local groups such as Friends of the Presumpscot River or Down East Salmon Federation or the Royal River Association or local TU chapters, Nature Conservancy, who are all involved in this work of river restoration, which includes not only removing obstacles such as dams, but also conserving riverine habitat. So I know that the group who's here today for this Lunch and Learn, many of you are supporters of that, and so I just want to say thank you for your support for all of those organizations and their work. And also just to emphasize that this takes many years. The Edwards dam removal was probably the fastest, and that took a decade. The Penobscot River Restoration Project, that was 15 years. The Presumpscot work is 2.5 decades. So it is a long haul process, but the rewards are incredible. Just that opening slide of the Edwards Dam, when that was breached, just seeing the change to the lower Kennebec based on that is enough to make everyone committed to doing this work going forward. I also want to emphasize that for these dams that we're talking about, this is primarily I should also note that I also should give a shout out to the state of Maine and the Department of Marine Resources, which has been very good over the years on river restoration. And I know former Commissioner LaPointe, I think I saw him joining us today, and current Commissioner Kelleher have been really good partners on this on many cases. It's important to note that the dams we're talking about are only a small portion of the dams in Maine. There's probably about 750 dams in Maine. Of those, only about 120 are generating electricity or associated with electric generation and are governed by the federal government under the Federal Power Act. I know I'd rather have more questions than going through the details of this. So I'll try and be brief. Hydroelectric licenses are very long, 25 to 40 years. So the opportunity when a dam comes up for relicensing only comes around literally every couple of decades. A lot of the projects that we've had success in the past on the Penobscot, on the Presumpscot, on the Kennebec came when the dams were up for relicensing, when their initial 40 or 50-year license term was up. At the time of relicensing, the federal agency, the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has to do a process of relicensing. FERC's focus is on energy. It is not an environmental and natural resource agency, but the opportunity to ensure that dams don't have an oversized adverse impact on natural resources arises because other federal resource agencies, particularly the National Marine Fisheries Service and Fish and Wildlife Service, have opportunities to comment and to actually prescribe conditions in the licenses, as does the state of Maine. Maine's only opportunity with respect to these federal licenses under the Clean Water Act. Maine has the opportunity and the right to certify that the operations of the dam or the presence of the dam meets the water quality standards for that river. And I just want to emphasize how important that is. You'll often see water quality standards are approved by the state legislature. And so you'll often see that there are planned upgrades or downgrades to water quality standards. Those standards come into play during the certification process for these dams. So the state can either certify that the dam, keeping the dam in and its operations will meet water quality standards, or it can condition its water quality certification, saying if the dam owner does X, Y, and Z, then we can certify that it will meet water quality standards. Or the state can deny a water quality standard, a water quality certification. If the state denies a water quality certification, then the dam cannot be relicensed. So it is the one opportunity that the state has over the course of several decades to really enforce its water quality standards on the dam owner or operator. The other piece I would just add is that the dams are also subject to other federal statutes like the Endangered Species Act or the Clean Water Act, and that comes into play here on the Kennebec. So what does this mean for the Kennebec and the 4 dams that Jeff was just talking about? Right now, one of the dams, the Shawmut Dam, is up for relicensing. The other 3 dams will be up for relicensing soon as well. So that provides the opportunity, as I just said, for the state and federal resource agencies to take a look at the operations of the Shawmut Dam and determine whether or not those operations will meet water quality standards and what conditions should be applied in order to do so. Here, the Department of Marine Resources issued a draft denial of water quality certification back in the spring. And they did that because they said that the operation of the Shawmut Dam and the other 3 dams would prevent the restoration and recovery of Atlantic salmon, that the fish passage proposals presented by the owner of the dams, Brookfield Renewable Energy, which is one of the largest hydroelectric owners in the world, that those measures that it was proposing would not be enough to ensure that Atlantic salmon restoration would proceed. And so the state was prepared to deny the water quality certification. Brookfield, seeing the writing on the wall, withdrew its application for water quality certification and plans to refile that in the coming months. We don't think that Brookfield will be able to change its operations of its dams enough to meet the concerns identified by the state of Maine. So we are expecting that to be refiled sometime this spring. And as our groups did previously, we will be commenting on that and supporting, hopefully continuing to support the department's position that the dams operation of the dams in no way can meet water quality standards. We are also the relicensing process also requires FERC to go through the National Environmental Policy Act process, the NEPA process. And in that process, which is a procedural process, is one that requires FERC to gather all of the information necessary about the impacts of the project before making its decision to relicense the project. In the past, FERC had conducted the less complete version of what's required under NEPA, an environmental assessment, and has recently just indicated that it's likely to go to the more stringent review process, an environmental impact statement having to do with the relicensing of the Shawmut Dam. We support that, as do the federal agencies, as does the Penobscot Indian Nation, as do a number of other groups. And there's a legal hook there if they fail to do a proper EIS. And the last legal issue at the Kennebec is a complaint that was filed this past fall, alleging by our 5 organizations against Brookfield, alleging that operations of the dams are violating the Endangered Species Act. And they're violating the Endangered Species Act because they are killing Atlantic salmon through their operations. And because Atlantic salmon are an endangered species, any death of an Atlantic salmon, as well as any adverse impact to critical habitat for Atlantic salmon, is a violation of the Endangered Species Act, unless the dam owner has received approval for a limited amount of what are called takes. And currently, these dams are operating without such approval for those limited takes. So our organizations, and I should mention here that in addition to CLF as lawyers, we're very lucky to have 2 lawyers from Norman Hanson in Detroit, Russ Pierce and Joe Mavadonis, and Chuck Verrill as part of our legal team. We have filed this complaint for violations under the Endangered Species Act. We are currently waiting a decision on a preliminary injunction that we filed to limit operations of the dams, and we'll be going forward with this litigation this spring. So that's a very quick run through the legal aspects of this. The last piece I would just note is that, of course, this is also a political issue. Brookfield Renewable has a lot of resources, and they are bringing them to bear on this. They are very much opposed to removing these dams. They have failed to really come to the table and talk about real options for moving forward. Instead, they have worked to try and create conflict amongst other users of the river. One particular use involves the Sappi paper mill, which withdraws a lot of water from the Kennebec as part of its operations. And there is concern that dam removal could impact those operations. Our organizations, as has Governor Mills, have made very clear that the continued and successful operation of the Sappi mill is critical. And we strongly believe that the dams can be removed without having adverse impact on those operations, and remain open to that. But that has become a political issue. We expect some legislation in this upcoming session introduced by Senator Jackson that could potentially limit the state's authority to under the Clean Water Act to issue or not issue water quality certifications. And quite frankly, we'll be looking to this audience and others to help push back against any such legislation, because that water quality certification is the only tool the state has to control what happens on the state rivers through these hydroelectric facilities. And the last thing I would just note is that these dams do produce hydroelectricity, and there is a decent amount that comes from these dams. But it's worth noting that the size of the impoundments that Jeff talked about, basically the reservoirs behind the dams, far exceed the amount of acreage that would be required if you were to replace the amount of energy from the dams with solar panels. So this is not, and I would note that the amount of hydro, while it's not insignificant, it's about 40 megawatts all told, is a very small number, less than 2 or 3% of the total amount of renewable energy generated in the state of Maine. But I did want to note that that is an issue that some will play. So I'll stop there because I hope there's some good questions in the chat. I would emphasize that this is an incredible opportunity to restore what is likely to be the most productive, what could be the most productive river in the United States for Atlantic salmon. That's an opportunity that we can't let pass. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Jeff. That's just an absolutely fabulous introduction to the biology, the politics, and the whole process of dam removal and river restoration. Really, really appreciate it. We've got a ton of fabulous questions. But before we get to those, I want to share a couple of calls to action. It may have crossed your mind during this conversation that there are a lot of people with a lot of opinions about and a lot of expertise about river restoration. We are going to share in the follow-up email that goes out later this afternoon a video, an op-ed, and a news article that will help flesh out those perspectives for you, even more than we've done here today. You will also see in that follow-up email a way to add your voice in support of a free-flowing Kennebec River. We don't have a particular call to action right now, but signing up there is a great way to stay up to date when the bill that Sean and Jeff both mentioned does get printed. I'll tell you now, it hasn't been printed yet, so I don't have an LD number for all of you legislative activists to write down. But if you sign up on that link, you will get information when it becomes available. All right, let's dig right into it. Dam ownership. I know Brookfield owns the 4 dams that we're talking about today, and that Brookfield is an international company with subsidiaries that own dams all over it, I think. Is that typical? Is that how dam ownership generally works, or who else owns dams in Maine?
I'll jump first. If we're talking about hydropower dams, they're generally owned by private companies. I don't think there's a handful of dams on the Mousom that are owned by a quasi-municipal local generator, local utility, but almost all the hydropower dams in Maine are owned by private companies. And a huge change over my career, when I started, these 4 dams would have had, if I'm remembering right, 4 different owners, but the consolidation of ownership into a few large companies is a change that's happened over, I don't know, the last 10 to 15 years. And so Brookfield not only owns these dams, but Brookfield is now, by a significant chunk, the largest hydro dam owner in Maine, and probably New England if we look more broadly.
That's right. I think many of them used to be owned by the paper companies themselves, or private entrepreneurs, but now they've been consolidated.
And then, Sean, you gave us some numbers about how many dams in Maine are hydropower dams and how many
That's
are
right.
other. Can you say
That's
those
right.
numbers again?
Sure. It's roughly 750 total dams in the state of Maine, and of those, about 100 to 125 are associated with power generation. Now, not all of them generate power. Some of them are storage dams, but the ones that generate power are subject to the Federal Power Act. And so, and then the other ones, so the remaining 600 are subject to some state law, but it's more difficult. They've got subject to water level requirements and safety requirements, but generally not a whole lot with respect to the day-to-day operations.
And so what are those 600 dams for?
Well, so a lot of them are historical remnants. So for example, on the Royal River in Yarmouth, there are 2 dams, and those 2 dams are historical dams. Neither of them generate power anymore. One of them used to generate just a little less than 1 megawatt for a mill right there. So you're really talking about, 18th, 19th century industrial revolution, where your mills had their dams for generating their power. And so you have a lot of those. You have a lot that are left. There's some for flood control. And there are many that have just been, they have dammed rivers in order to create artificial lakes. That those come with their own issues.
And I'll add, Kathleen, I just add one other category to that. There are also a lot of those dams in Maine are at the outlets of natural lakes that have raised by, a foot or 2, or in some cases 6 or 8 feet. I can't remember how many of those there are, but at least in the developed parts of the state, most of the lakes have some kind of outlet control structure that's probably being counted in that list of dams.
Okay, that's really interesting. So even if they aren't serving an energy purpose, there are some good reasons that these dams exist. It sounds like there are also some that maybe there's not a good reason that they're there. Is that fair?
I think that
He's now.
Yeah, I think that there's when you're talking about the broader health of the river ecosystem, yeah, for a lot of them, they don't make sense. I think some of the things that make things complicated are people are used to having, a pond. And so if you take out that outlet dam, you're not going to have the pond anymore. I think when the Edwards Dam was being proposed to be removed, lots and lots of people were worried about what was going to happen to the shores on the Kennebec. Same thing on the Presumpscot, same thing on the Penobscot. But I think those 3 cases show that it actually is okay to return the rivers back to their normal structures, and it's good for the environment and it's good for the communities. Westbrook is loving having the dam out at Sakarapa Falls, and it's really wonderful to see communities which had for a century turned their backs to the rivers, right, as we use them for open sewers as well as a power source, now returning and focusing on those rivers. That's a really great opportunity for the state.
Just Kathleen, just a quick anecdote. I remember when I was still a volunteer, not working for TU, going to a public meeting on the Edwards Dam removal, and there was a dairy farmer from Sydney back in the days when we had dairy farmers in Sydney, who got up, and his biggest concern was that his cows were going to walk across the Kennebec to Vassalboro because the river was going to dry up and be gone. And so far as I know, no Sydney cows ever ended up over across the river in Vassalboro.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a lot of this change is hard, right? And so we are used to the river system looking a certain way.
Right.
from our perspective. But when we think about it from the salmon perspective, the fish perspective, it's a whole nother thing. There's clearly a history of dam removal, and I imagine good data on the impact for fish populations, including salmon. How long does that historical record go back, and does it help build the case?
Well, so the best source on our having lost our sea run fish runs is there was a set of reports that were pulled together in the mid to late 1800s called the reports of the state fisheries commissioners. I don't have the title exactly right, but there were several individuals over a period of decades who were the state fish commissioner. And at that point, the loss of our fish was still recent enough that it was in people's living memory, right? So the first big rush of dam building in Maine, on bigger rivers at least, was like 1830 to 1850. So by 1870, 1880, people were going, oh my God, we built all these dams. What did we lose on the Kennebec and the Penobscot and the St. Croix? And so these fish commissioners went around and they went from river to river and they talked to the old timers about how it used to be. And they looked at what was happening now, and there were fishways on some dams that were or weren't working. And largely the historical record that ties the loss of our sea run fisheries primarily to the construction of these dams is built on those fish commissioners' reports, which in some cases are incredibly detailed if you go back and go in and look at them. More recently, if you ask the converse question, which is, what do we know about what happens when dams are removed and fish recovery? We have really good data on the Kennebec. I shared a slide with some of the numbers, but we have gone from 0 to at least 3.5 million alewives a year above Augusta through the removal of Edwards and Fort Halifax and construction of fishways at some lake outlets and other sites as well. Fishways can be effective, especially for river herring. On the Penobscot, a very similar picture. I think recovery was fast. I was quite involved with the Penobscot project, and I used to tell people, hey, you're going to have to wait a decade or so to see recovery of fish stocks. The first year after Edwards and Great Works were out of the river, we had 700 shad return in a fishable shad run in Old Town above what used to be 2 dams where nobody had caught a shad since it was known as shad rips. And literally Penobscot Indians and white settlers were killing each other over the right to the shad fishing rights there in the early 1800s. And the shad had been gone since the dams were first built in the early 1830s. They were back as soon as the dams were gone, which is, I mean, just a remarkable story.
I would just add that the historical information is critical, because for a lot of these battles, the dam owners will say, well, fish were never up there. So that's important, not only for the FERC, for the hydropower relicensing, but Maine has its own law that allows citizens to petition the state if they can show that there are native anadromous fish. Anadromous means they spawn in the river, go out to the ocean to live, and come back to the river to die and spawn. And if you can show that they are below the dam and that there's habitat above the dam, then you can petition to force a dam owner to put in a fishway. That's what happened on the Presumpscot River. So having that historical data is critical for much of this work.
That's fascinating and great. I feel like I want to go read those fisher. What did you say, Jeff?
The reports of the fisheries commissioners of the state of Maine.
I bet that there's some good stories in those reports.
I don't have it right now,
I think they came out. I think it was every 5 years they would appoint you to be the fish commissioner and do an updated report.
So, Jeff, you mentioned that one of the big problems is that in this case, having so many dams in such a short period, it's really compounding those challenges for the salmon. Does that mean that it doesn't really help to only remove one? I mean, is it an all or nothing, or on a river that has many dams, can you pick them off one at a time, or do you really need to do it all at once?
Well, you can, right? I mean, that's why 25 years ago we were all focused on Edwards, right? We get the first one because nobody was going to talk about even fishways at any other dam on the Kennebec as long as Edwards sat where it sat. So that's one way to do it, and that got us 17 miles of river. And fortunately, it was phenomenally good habitat for river herring and shad and striped bass and 2 species of sturgeon, which wouldn't go above Waterville, and they all recovered. But what we didn't do was get access to salmon habitat. We were anticipating at that point. The original schedule was after Edwards came out, very quickly, 4 fishways would be built and fish could swim to the Sandy River by 2008, which is why my organization and ASF worked to take out the Madison Electric Works Dam in 2006. So we'd be ready when it happened. And that has not been how things have progressed over the last 15 years. So, I think you can only work on these when the opportunity presents itself. And the FERC process has presented an opportunity to look at Shawmut. And we have said, Shawmut's the 3rd dam on the river. You can't look at Shawmut without looking at the 2 dams below it and the dam above it. And we fought about that for 2 years before FERC finally agreed with us and said, you're right, we got to do an EIS and look at all 4 dams. That just happened. We're expecting that EIS, the draft, to be out next August. People asked about comment opportunities. When that EIS comes out next summer, there will definitely be comment opportunities on it. We're asking people to think big. We thought a lot bigger than we thought about Edwards on the Penobscot, and we took out 2 dams and built a bypass at Howland. The difference on the Kennebec is that we would have the opportunity to make it so that there are no dams between the ocean and Labrador, where salmon have to go to, and the best. There is other habitat as good. There is no habitat better, and there's certainly no big chunk of habitat better than the Sandy, and we can make that accessible with no dams. On the Penobscot, we have some habitat that's accessible after passing through 1 fishway at Milford, other that's 2 dams or 3 dams. But here we have a chance to get at least 1 big chunk of great habitat in Maine restored to at least the access it had pre-dams 200 years ago. And that's I don't see that opportunity coming up again in my life. I'm 55. This is the one shot we're going to get at doing something that big. And I'm not sure I see it, in the next 20 years after that on any of the other rivers in Maine, because there isn't all that much habitat as good or as big as the Sandy going around.
I'm convinced. Thank you. We have so many questions that we don't have time to get to, and I'm going to send them all to you because I want to know the answers too, particularly around what climate change has, what's the impact, and how is it, are there climate resilience reasons to remove or maintain dams? And gosh, we could talk all day, but we won't. Thank you all for joining us today. You will get an email later this afternoon with the recording from today, the links to those resources we mentioned, and a way to sign up to stay posted on all of these upcoming opportunities to get involved. So thank you all for your fabulous questions. I hope you will join us next week. We will have Maine law professor Scott Bloomberg here with us to talk about his recent proposal that Chief Justice John Roberts is in a very interesting position to potentially create the norm of Supreme Court justices retiring after serving 18 years on the court. Next year is Chief Justice Roberts' anniversary, 18 years on the court. So this is a very timely conversation, and hope you will join us. Jeff, Sean, thanks a million. Have a great rest of your snowy day, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.